Hi, and welcome to Champion Brief's video topic discussion for the first time for 2020. With me today is Amanda Ciocca, and we'll be discussing the first topic for the year, resolved. In a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. To start out, I think it's important to think about like the scope of the topic. So Amanda, what were your first thoughts when you saw the topic about what it meant?
When I first saw the topic, I was actually quite interested because normally LD kind of gets like very actor specific topics, either the US or just something a lot more specific. And the moment I saw democracy, that immediately opened up so many other areas of research that we can do, especially because I feel like so many people, when they hear democracy and voting, it immediately just shifts to this very like US centric idea of what that would kind of like facilitate in regards to a response from the public. But I feel like there are so many more areas of discussion that can allow for better education on certain countries that may not have the type of democracy we have or may not function the same way we do. And I think that definitely gives a lot of people a strategic advantage because you'd only have to prove specific instances of democracy where compulsory voting should be, happening. And I just think that that's very unique. In my debate experience, have never come across a topic that has given me as much scenario planning as this one has given me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, just from like an international perspective, you have countries like Australia who do have compulsory voting. And then I think also just from the nature of the topic and its wording, I mean, my gut instinct was electoral politics, but the topic doesn't specify that. The topic just says voting in a
Yeah.
democracy. And so, like, that I feel like opens it up also to a much bigger area. Like, apps that may just defend electoral politics may get kind of stuck in some topicality issues because negs can be like, so should, people with conflicts of interest be compelled to vote in Congress or local elections, local politics, like school board? Um, you know, how many little conflicts of interest can occur within a school board vote of just like, you know, construction companies and contractors and everything. Judges technically on panels vote to make a decision, and they could have conflicts of interest. And now, are they supposed to be forced to vote through that? Like, compulsory voting, I think, goes a lot further than just the election when
And that's
it's not
actually,
specified.
yeah, that's quite interesting because I have actually judged a few camp tournaments over the summer, and it didn't even process through my mind that it is not just exclusive to electorate voting. And I think a lot of people have kind of jumped the gun very quickly and just immediately like shifted to that area of research. But there are so many other means of the voting process in a democracy that don't necessarily mean like direct like federal government relationship or direct like big national government relationship.
Yeah.
Like it can be very local, like localized institutions that are still engaging in that voting process within the bounds of being like a democratic nation.
Yeah, I mean, even more so than you get to like businesses, right? Stockholders. Functionally, it's democratic votes. Each stockholder, each stock is a vote, and it's a share of a vote and percentage of a vote. So every stockholder then has to vote on every stockholder decision instead of just allowing it to be done by proxy and things like that. And there are so many more questions that you can get to that I think opens up the topic to a really big, broad area if you like just take a minute to think about it more than just elections.
Yeah, you definitely have to step out of bounds because I mean, I have debated so many topics that were very US centric, either like localized or federal politics. And this can bring so many more questions to the table on questions of like environmental actions or even just very like localized education or even just, I mean, the everyday life of a citizen. Like there
Yeah,
are
I mean,
so many things that this
policing, I
can
think,
affect.
now comes up really importantly
Absolutely.
because electoral politics with policing is going to be super important in the next couple of years, and how local elections go, so too probably will local police departments and things like that. City council is going to play a big role in how policing looks in the future of this country,
Yeah.
probably. So
It's definitely super important to, I guess, raise awareness for a lot of the things that don't necessarily have super direct lines of connection to federal government, because there are so many minute alleyways that a lot of this debate can kind of boil down to, because there are such a wide array of perspectives that people can look at, whether it's focusing on the economic policies of, private businesses, private industries, or even again, like focusing on like law enforcement. There are so many routes that I feel like a lot of people kind of don't pay attention to when they first glance at the topic, because immediately it's like, I got to go start prepping, like I got to go start finding research, especially in the state of the world right now. And the US election coming up, everyone's focused on that. Like everyone is going to be focused on US election, Trump versus Biden. And there are so many other things that can play huge factors into the election coming up that will definitely be super important for kids of voting age to learn about, especially when a lot of those kids of voting age are judging at tournaments online. Kind of being aware of a lot of the more like localized politics and things that kind of don't get, publicized on the news is so crucial.
yeah, I think the expansion of online debates going to make actually some local arguments and stuff like that even more important and more interesting. Actually, if I'm sitting here in Florida and I listen to maybe debaters from across the country who are talking about issues that are local to them, it's actually interesting to hear some of those topics and discussions of what local politics looks like somewhere else in the world. And there's going to be a lot of that, I think, this year. I just want to note there is the word ought in the resolution. And, every time we hear the word ought, we automatically go to a moral obligation. So I
Yeah.
think like that's kind of the first framework choice that a lot of people are going to go to is look to support the morality of voting and the morality of compulsory voting. My first initial instinct is, well, compulsory acts are probably going to be immoral under some philosophical justifications because,
Yeah.
compulsory by nature is coercion.
Mm-hmm.
In your research for the brief, did you find any like moral justifications to compel people to vote?
From what I guess the big thing for me is the definition debate and how that plays into a huge factor of kind of what ought would justify as being moral or immoral. There are, such a wide array of different interpretations of definitions that exist on what compulsory voting would necessarily mandate. Because there are so many people that believe that compulsory voting is just, showing up to the polls and, if you don't want to vote in an election, submitting a blank ballot. So then you're not compelled to make a decision, but you're compelled to participate. Where there are others that kind of make this really, really interesting comparison that even if someone is compelled to go to the polls, it's still the act of the government kind of forcing a participatory mandate in elections that could swing someone's perspective just because of how involved the government is when it comes to forcing individuals to, submit a ballot or make a decision. And I think something very important for debaters to kind of like draw the line at is what compulsory voting is.
Yeah, it's really important because I think that's going to lead to a lot of different advantages and disadvantages from, punishments and stuff like that. Is there a punishment for not showing up? How does that affect different segments of the population? If voting's compulsory, does everybody have the day off of work? Things like that. That makes super important
Yeah,
issues
this
on this
definitely
topic.
actually reminds me of a topic that I debated, the qualified immunity topic, where it was very hard for people to kind of pinpoint a definition and have both debaters agree on what qualified immunity was and what that would guarantee, not guarantee. And I feel like the definition debate and topicality debate on this topic is going to be absolutely insane. because there are so many definitions that exist, because this has been like a hot topic since there are a lot of countries that have, tried and tested compulsory voting. There are countries that have compulsory voting. And so there's just so much more available literature, which, number one, having so much available literature, I wish I would have had that for so many debate topics that I had, but also it kind of allows us to see what's working. Like, this isn't just like, if this were to happen, what would we do? Because we've had so many of those kind of like hypothetical topics. If we do this, then what would happen? Or would that be moral, or would that be immoral? We've seen, like, in person how these things have worked in other places, which is insane to see that an LD topic has such like concrete literature and concrete examples of what's been happening, since LD is such like a philosophical event.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that, like, for once there's an LD topic where you can be like, well, what's the empirical example for then? Australia or Norway, there are a bunch of different countries that have different types of compulsory level voting. So let's, I guess, look at some of the pros and cons of compulsory voting. In America, we have about, I think it's around 54 to 56% who vote in presidential elections. That number goes a little bit low, gets much lower, depending on the, importance of the elections. Gubernatorial elections, a little higher, House lower, local elections, you're lucky maybe if you get 30 to 40% turnout for a lot of them. So what would that maybe mean in terms of the United States? Let's, I guess, start there and go broader.
Yeah, sure. So I think something super important for kind of the pro side of compulsory voting is that it would not inhibit an individual's freedom to still make their own choice, again, depending on definition. But from a lot of the literature that I've come across, it seems that blank ballots are legitimate enough to abide by what the compulsory voting standards would
It's
be
still a
hypothetically.
statement.
Yeah. And I think that that is really important when it comes to how candidates target campaigns, because I think a lot of politics right now within the media are just very polarized, because they are intended to target specific people that they know participate in the election. And they don't really have the numbers on people that are kind of like uninterested or don't really want to vote for either candidate. And I think the action of kind of compulsory voting inducing like this blank ballot kind of scenario would be super interesting to see the reaction when it comes to not only localized politics, but national politics, because I feel like that would shift the way that a lot of campaigns would run.
Thinking about that even more, just on a ballot, you have a lot of people who are, I guess, disenchanted with the two major political parties here. I think there's probably an argument that you see a rise of more third-party politics, at least on a representative level in Congress when it comes to the United States, because you have people who are going to vote who may not really be inclined to vote Republican or Democrat, but may see themselves more as a libertarian candidate or a Green Party candidate. And with a larger voting base, I think there's probably a decent argument that third-party politics may take a little bit of hold, at least in our legislative bodies. I don't know about our presidential politics yet, but
yeah, I actually agree a lot with what you just said. I think third-party politics has kind of been a very understated area in a lot of debates, like in high school debate, but also on like national stage. You don't really hear a lot about third-party politics because, again, going back to the media being very polarized, is either like you're Democrat or you're Republican. There's no kind of middle way. Like, we have created such a divide because the numbers of voting either show Republican or Democrat. Like, that's normally what you see. You watch during the presidential election, we're either turning states blue or red. You don't really see that in between. And I think it's also really important to note that there's a very big opportunity for a lot of communities to participate in like the most recent elections, which will be, presidential election, which will change the way that politics will be for the next 4 years. We've seen the Trump administration, and it's kind of like we don't know what's going to happen. And I have read so many articles for this topic that were all about a lot of marginalized populations having the ability to sway the election. If they decide to participate in the election, it could change the outcome. And to me, that is so crazy, because I remember when I was in civics class in middle school, where we weren't really learning about like how things could so drastically change the outcome. It was just like, you should probably vote. Like, it's important. There was no like super intense, like, this is really important. Like, you being of legal age to vote, you could do something. Like, this is so key to our politics, our way of life. And I think so many people kind of associate voting as almost like this privilege to be attained, rather than it's something that we all necessarily have the right to like make a decision. And I think that's really important to emphasize when it comes to the affirmative. It's depending, again, like on the definition, it's a question of, are you maximizing the right you have to its fullest potential?
So I think you hinted actually at my favorite negative argument, which is voter apathy, and voter education counterplans. The problem in countries isn't necessarily that people should be forced to go out to vote. It's that people should want to embrace that democratic norm and have that, inner want to vote and that drive to vote. To kind of borrow from Nietzsche, you need that will to power to vote in a democratic society. And democracy should instill that feeling in people. And if it doesn't, then it's not the fault of the people to vote. It's the fault of the government and the institutions to make it more important for people to go out and vote and to feel the need to contribute to their government. So I think that may contribute, just because I'm now forced to vote, if I still don't care about politics, if I still don't care about government, is that going to create good results? Am I going to vote for the best candidate, or am I going to vote for a populist, or am I going to vote for, somebody who kind of talks to dictatorial norms and things like that? Demagogues tend to work better in uneducated societies. So when you have a voter base that doesn't care, or isn't, up to date on actual political issues, what's that going to do? Like, I think that's a very important negative argument on it. Do we create a more moral government that way?
I definitely think the way you worded that too is very important to emphasize, because I feel like a lot of people associate like the lack of education type argument to be very almost like targeted. And that's definitely not the right route to go with this topic. It's not forcing some sort of like targeted argument onto groups of people. It's a question of overall education when it comes to these types of elections, because they're definitely, again, going back to the media and everything, the way that things are so polarized, you definitely don't get the full story about anything. You have to do your own research and figure that out. And the way information is kind of spoon-fed to us, that begs the question, are people actually wanting to know this information, or do they kind of not care? And I think that also kind of brings up another negative argument that I have done some research on, which is the accessibility counterplan. Something that's super important right now that has been discussed for ages and ages is a question of, does everyone have equal access to polling places? Does everyone have an equal opportunity to actually go where they need to go to submit a ballot? And I think something that's really important is focusing on the individual's right to a private vote, and like that sense of security when they're submitting their ballot. I've read a bunch of stories about how those who are in need of such accessibility standards have been, interrogated by people that are working in polling places, or they're not trained well enough to handle those situations, so they come off like extremely rude. And I think that's something that kind of needs to force the AF to be like, well, are you just kind of forcing people to vote? Like, what happens if they can't get there? Like, what happens if they can't? Like, what happens? What are the repercussions? And it will be very hard in my mind for the affirmative to get out of that kind of question,
Yeah.
because it is so hard to be like, yeah, we're going to force people to vote, but like, we don't worry about this yet.
Yeah.
That's another day's
No,
problem.
that's a whole other thing. Because then you deal with, well, people can't show up to vote, so they're going to get punished. How is that a moral system when you create a punishment but don't expand access? Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's really important, by the way, to make note when we talk about voter education. It's not really about like how much knowledge a person has or anything like that. It's about being educated on issues that politicians have to deal with. You know, do you know what the foreign policy of this person is going to be? Do you know if this person is, domestically, what they support? What are their ideals? Or are you just going into the ballot box and are you just checking a name for the sake of checking a name? And that becomes, again, very important back to what is compulsory voting. Can I fill out a blank ballot or do I have to check somebody's name? And so there are a lot of different questions that all trace back to those definitional debates.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, definition debate and topicality control the way that this debate ends.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Like, there's no way out of it. If you do not start off the debate with some type of definition, it's game over, because the aff or the neg can wreck each other, like total carnage, if you don't know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing I think that we need to talk is, what is a democratic society? Like, you have issues right now in Belarus, where you have a supposed president who was elected, and China, which claims that they have democratic policies and principles, even though it's a one-party system. In each of those, there is elements of democracy. Do you have compulsory voting now in China where every citizen has to vote for one party? And does that how does that legitimize governments? And is that good to force people to legitimize governments that may or may not be looking out for them? You can say it in America too. There are definitely plenty of scholars out there that say that the American government doesn't look out for its citizens of color, any, pick different categories. There are authors out there that say that. You can talk about patriarchy in the US government and about how the government doesn't really look out for women, doesn't necessarily look out for Black people in the ways that it looks out for white people. It doesn't look out for immigrants in the way that it looks out for citizens, and all sorts of different things. And so should forcing people to legitimize a government and, be put into those practices that may not benefit them, is that good? I think that that's going to be a very important argument, that like not voting and actually not showing up to a government is an important political statement as well.
Yeah, this definitely goes and ties in kind of to like the more freedom of expression argument that I've definitely researched in regards to the negative understanding of the topic, because I think that there are a lot of questions, and this kind of goes back to what I mentioned on the affirmative, is that there's kind of this question that's been posited underneath voting is like, is it considered a First Amendment freedom? Like, what necessarily does voting do as freedom of expression? Is it freedom of speech? Like, what is it considered? And I think it's really important for the negative to kind of highlight and differentiate the idea of voting and the idea of like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and try and hold the affirmative to an idea of like, what does your voting, like, what does forcing voting do? Like, what does that do for a democracy that, again, faces all of these structural problems that will kind of become numb to a lot of people if we just begin to legitimize what democracies do to billions of people every single year?
Yeah, I mean, you have corrupt democracies all over the world. Vladimir Putin is technically a democratically elected leader. And, there are all sorts of questions over the legitimacy of the vote, but he can sit there and go, hey, I won 90% of a free and fair election, and make that claim. And, if you have everybody participating in that supposedly free and fair election, even though it may be, rife with corruption, are you legitimizing a corrupt government and a corrupt system, or just a system that doesn't ensure safety for all citizens or really ensure the voice of all citizens.
This
So I
actually
think,
reminds me of kind of like the novice state topic from when I was a freshman, which was like almost 6 years. I don't know. That's kind of weird for me. But it was like the US should promote democracy in the Middle East. And I remember when I was negating, I was like, well, if we begin to legitimize human right violations that have consistently been present in US democracy, and we are promoting like good ideas of democracy, like what does that look like? What do we think a good democracy looks like if we begin to be very numb to all of the things that are happening around us? And I definitely think that those kinds of arguments are very important for the negative to harp on, because I feel like the app will be very scared and try and cut corners very, very quickly when it comes to asking those questions. And I think that interrogation kind of needs to be getting cross-ex, because that's where a lot of affirmatives just combust.
yeah, I think if we're talking about, political expression being limited in some way by making voting compulsory, you get a very clear anti-democratic argument that it's not in the best interest of democracy then. So there's some really interesting ways that the negative can go about, like kind of twisting what should on face be like, yeah, more people are voting, that's more democracy, right?
Right.
To be actually kind of insidious, coercive, and anti-democratic. So yeah, there are a lot of really interesting strategies. I think on a final note, I just want to talk a little bit about some critical arguments that we can address, and also a little bit on some policy style. We hinted 2020 election. Um, there's obviously going to be pros and cons that are going to be thrown out about both candidates from people of, various political persuasions that are very, very compelling arguments. You briefly hinted at an accessibility argument. What counter plans? Because I think that's going to be a core negative strategy, actually, do you think are going to
Yeah.
be really important?
It's crazy because I don't think I have encountered a topic with as many available counter plans to students in a hot minute. And I mean, ranging from like an accessibility counter plan to, I mean, oh my gosh, there was another one that was just like increasing voter education that I judged at one of the summer camp tournaments. And it was all about focusing on, not polarizing politics, focusing on making sure that, enough information is being spread to literally anyone who is curious, but from sources that just like aren't so focused on who's going to win. Rather, here are some important information that you need about, situation when it comes to immigrants, situation when it comes to economic policies. And I think that that is very interesting, because I think that counters a lot of the affirmative being like, well, we need to make sure that everyone's partaking in the election because we don't know public opinion. But again, with those types of more educational based counter plans, there can be such a wide array of information that can be available about like the everyday citizen, from Google searches to, social media to literally any article published. You have such a wide access to the public's opinion that if we didn't increase education, I mean, you see it today, not many people tend to participate a lot pre or post election when it comes to, asking questions. People are so scared to talk about who they vote for. They are so terrified of doing it. I remember when I was first like really getting involved into politics before I went up to college, I would be around so many like adults, like people my parents' age, that would be like, yeah, we voted, and totally avoid the subject. Because when people kind of inquire about, oh, really, like, why did you vote? Like the people that are very invested in politics, that are so focused, like to ask questions. And sometimes people are not able to answer those questions. And I think
Yeah.
that is super important to pay attention to, because it's how we understand the way people make decisions. And that's unavailable through the act of compulsory voting if we kind of just apply like, yeah, you're allowed to submit a blank ballot. But like, what does that do? How do I know? Like, how did you process politics? Like, what were you thinking? And it kind of eliminates like this psychological aspect that a lot of like campaigns look to engage in.
I just kind of had a thought actually about the blank ballot. When we think about governmental legitimacy and stuff like that, if people are not buying into the governmental process and caring about what governments do, is that a legitimate then government? If like I no longer care who is my leader and I'm no longer, do they have really the will of the people then? Or is it just kind of the will of a slim majority of the minority?
That's interesting because that would open up the floor to so many more questions about, if we start becoming numb to social issues, what happens? If we start becoming numb to the way that we engage with other democracies, what happens? If we begin to kind of interact but not fulfill, the proper promotion of human rights, what happens? Like, if we choose to participate in politics but then submit ourselves via the blank ballot, how is that showing, for example, in other nations that are experiencing terrible, terrible, terrible things? What does that tell them about us?
It's almost
How
like
do
a
we look?
disingenuous form of democracy. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
look, we have people voting and they really don't care about society. My first instinct was social contract, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's kind of voting is our expression of the social contract. We consent of our government. It's the kind of shows our consent to be governed by these people. So if so many people submit blank ballots or so many people just don't vote, is the government really an expression of the consent of the people, or is the government just this benign entity that is there and exists and some people buy into it, but most people just sit here and go, whatever, that's the authority, I don't really care, I'm just going to live my life? And does that actually represent a democratic society then? I think there are a lot of philosophical questions that this topic really can get to if you begin to analyze it in
Oh,
kind of
for sure.
like just to ask different questions about the topic, and it's like
There definitely can, and I guess this leans more on the critical route. There definitely can be negative strategies that center around the idea of kind of like creating this stigma around becoming numb to other actors.
mm-hmm.
Like the ways that we engage in foreign relations compared to what would happen if we kind of just, submit a blank ballot. Yeah, haha, like we have higher vote rates than you. Like, what are you going to do about it? We're this global superpower. And it's like, are we really invested in promoting the ideas that we harp ourselves so much on, that, we promote equality, we promote, equality of the sexes, equality of literally everyone? Like, do we encompass that? Are we actually promoting that, or are we becoming so disconnected from the idea that it kind of flies over our heads and becomes so non-existent that we can't even become proper advocates on how to fix that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a lot of social justice issues that kind of connect back to this, critique of democracy and, normalization of democratic politics that kind of trades off one human rights violation for another human rights violation. We can only do so much, so we'll address this human rights issue, but not this one. Or, we need to keep the economy going, so the environment doesn't matter as much. That creates issues, all sorts of different just trade-offs within regular everyday politics that numb us to kind of those issues and desensitize us. Like, yeah, okay, we
Yeah.
can trade off, a couple of lives here for some lives there, and there's definitely a desensitization that occurs with
Yeah,
politics.
it definitely poses a question of, are we looking at votes as more of a question of quantity over quality, and how that would create a different environment that the everyday citizen would exist in. And, how would that affect our relations with other countries?
Mm-hmm.
And I think
So it's
something to
almost like the
even
people
question
who
is like,
want to vote, those are the people who probably care about the issues, are engaged with the issues, and you're that 55% of the population are the ones who are already engaged and care. How will
yeah.
we get the other 45?
And then when it comes to adjusting campaigns, like I'm sure the affirmative could have the high chance of bringing up changing the direction of campaigns and how they function. Would that then affect the votes that were more of quantity based rather than quality based?
You get money
How
into play there.
mm-hmm.
How does where does large business side in those elections? How do ads play? Facebook, all
Exactly.
the digital politics and everything like that. Of because you're now reaching out to more people. Who better accesses those? What systems are those more? Are those easy to manipulate and everything like that? So, do more votes lead to more corruption? Maybe because you have a just vote buying and all sorts of different things that could exist, and populist pleasers. It's kind
Yeah.
of that's the way I if I go out there and promise everybody $1 million, I may not, that 45% of the population that never votes may sit there and go, hey, this guy is promising to get us 45 every person $1 million, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know much about politics, but he's working for me. And there's no substance necessarily behind it, or the substance behind it is contradictory. Or
Yeah, I definitely think that there can be some available critical literature that almost talks about like the digitalization of democracy and
mm-hmm,
how compulsory voting would kind of force campaigns to just broaden the horizons technology wise and just flood.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of people would say that that inhibits our ability to make our own decisions, because there are tons of research that talks about, the amount of times you need to see an advertisement before you go on the website and buy something, the amount of times you need to see something more than once in order for you to like go check it out or go click on the photo or go like it or go comment. And I think that that is something that is extremely important for the negative to kind of emphasize, is that yes, we use technology right now, but it's a question of, if we do use compulsory systems, would that then force democracy to just take over the digital era?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, especially because then how you look more towards advertisements and everything like that, and how insidious things could be. Foreign influence then of elections and democracy comes into play. Yeah, there is a lot that we can start looking into, even on the critical level, about how people think, symbology behind elections,
Yes.
and forcing people to engage in the symbolic act of voting. And Baudrillard definitely talks a lot about people engaging in symbolic acts, and how the symbolic act kind of diverts away from the real. Yeah, politics in general diverts away from the real in a lot of ways, because they're trying to fit narratives a lot of times. So yeah, there's I think a lot of good critical ground. So I think, just to kind of wrap it up and summarize, I feel like we've gotten a couple of key things. On the affirmative side, it looks like we have affirmatives needing to explain why there is a duty for the citizens to vote, and why compulsory voting doesn't necessarily mean actually putting someone's name down or some idea down. That apps really need to focus on winning that definition, that compulsory voting doesn't mean you actually have to say anything, you just have to participate in the process. And that just means I can be like, abstain, I'm here, I can vote present, all sorts of different things, but not actually for a person. The negative, it looks like, has a couple of easier routes on this topic, actually. They
Yeah.
can argue voting isn't, it's not the number of votes, it's about the quality of votes in a society that determines the democracy. So increasing voter education, decreasing voter apathy is important, not necessarily making it compulsory. The punishments for compulsory voting may make it immoral. And then also just on a level of what does more votes do? Can more votes benefit a society, or do more votes hurt a society? Seem about where we've gotten to at this point.
Absolutely.
Anything else you want to add, Amanda?
Honestly, I have never been a super heavy definitions person, but after doing so much research on this topic, even in the negative, there needs to be such a harsh focus on definitions because that can make or break your debate and make it super easy for you to win or super difficult for you to get out of a hole that you dug for yourself. And it's definitely so key to make sure that there's a focus on what compulsory voting is and also the consequences if you don't partake in compulsory voting and what that would do for a democracy. I definitely think those are just, they've stuck in my head for so long after judging so many debates over the summer because there are so many kids that just don't pay attention to the definition debate at all, and they just want to go offense, 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 and they don't focus on, their opponent has gotten up and said your definition does not work, that is not true, and has shattered them on the definition debate. So there definitely needs to, top priority, definition debate and framework, because that'll control the rest of the round.
Yep, very true. Well, for both me and Amanda, I want to thank you all for joining us on this topic discussion, and good luck on your topicality debates. Thank you.